My name is Randall Eggert. This class is Grammar and Stylistics. It's about writing clearly.
Punctuating the middle of a grammatical sentence, interrupters, and conjoined lists. This video is adapted from an appendix in Williams and Bissup's Style Lessons in Clarity and Grace. To understand what we're talking about here, you're going to have to understand the notion of a grammatical sentence. I've introduced this notion in other videos in this series. So there's one on sentence structure, and there's one on written versus spoken language. And in this case, we're looking at the middle of a grammatical sentence. In others in the series, we've looked at the end of a grammatical sentence or the beginning of a grammatical sentence. Now we're to the middle. The first notion that we need to understand is that of interrupters. So remember that a grammatical sentence consists of a noun phrase subject and a verb phrase predicate. And a verb phrase typically consists of the verb plus its complement. Those are the obligatory elements. And so the normal flow of a sentence is going to go from the noun phrase to the verb complement. And anytime we interrupt that normal flow, we need to indicate so, and we use punctuation to indicate it so that readers don't get confused, because readers expect things to go in a certain order: subject, verb, complement. So an interrupter interrupts that flow, and we want to indicate it. The first sort of interrupter that we're going to be looking at are non-restrictive relative clauses. There are two types of relative clauses. Relative clauses are these small sentences that modify nouns. So in that way, they behave somewhat similarly to adjectives or even preposition phrases, all of which can give information about the noun that's being identified in a noun phrase. Well, a restrictive relative clause is necessary information for identifying which referent is intended with the noun phrase. A non-restrictive relative clause, however, is going to give extra information. It could have just as easily been saved for a separate sentence. It's not necessary for identifying that noun phrase. Appositives, these are kind of interesting, where you take a noun phrase and then follow it immediately after with another noun phrase that refers to exactly the same thing. It's sort of a way of saying, okay, this is one way of understanding it, this is another way. This is one name for it, this is another name for it. Journalists are very fond of this because it's a way of squeezing information with a minimum of words. And then there's commentary, where the writer sort of comments on what is being said in the sentence. All of these can act as interrupters. So we'll start with non-restrictive relative clauses, and I'm going to give a contrast here. So compare the first one, which is a restrictive relative clause, with the second, which is a non-restrictive relative clause. And I want you to notice the difference in the way that I pronounce the two sentences, especially where I put the pauses. The students who attended every class received A's. The students who attended every class received A's. So in the first one, we're restricting the set to just those students who attended every class. Those are the students who received A's. In the second one, we're saying the students received A's, all of the students. And then we're giving this extra information, they attended every class. Right? It could have just been as easily been the students received A's, they attended every class, but we chose to put a non-restrictive relative clause there instead, keeping it part of the same sentence. Here's another example. His car that broke down is a yellow VW thing. His car which broke down is a yellow VW thing, versus his car which broke down is a yellow VW thing. So I want you to notice that with the restrictive relative clause, there's an assumption that this he, whoever it is, has more than one car. And the one that we're talking about is the one that broke down. And that one happens to be a yellow VW thing. In the second sentence, the assumption is he only has one car. And we're giving this extra information that it broke down. So you could say his car is a yellow VW thing, it broke down. In this one, we couldn't separate it. I also want you to notice that with the restrictive relative clause, you could use either that or which. Either one is grammatical. Whereas with non-restrictives, only which works. The that isn't going to work in that position. And again, we separate the non-restrictive relative clause with commas. And another example, Bill Clinton, who was the 42nd president, was a governor, versus the George Bush, who was the 43rd president, was a governor. So in this first one, as a proper name, it's kind of understood that a proper name automatically refers to whoever that individual is. You don't need to restrict it, unless more than one person happens to share that name, as the two George Bushes do. In this case, we use the to kind of turn a proper noun into a common noun, and then we can have a restrictive relative clause. So in the first case, it's a non-restrictive relative clause, surrounding it with commas. In the second, it's a restrictive relative clause, letting us know which George Bush we're talking about. Now we're going to look at appositives. Here, again, the idea is that we've got a noun phrase followed immediately after by another noun phrase with the same referent. So George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, was a congressman. Plagiarism, the use of another's words or ideas without proper citation, is usually thought of as a conscious act. So in any case, when we've got an appositive, we want to separate it off so that readers, again, aren't confused, so that they know that this is an interrupter of sorts. Commas could be used, dashes could be used, parentheses could be used. And in fact, that's probably true of just about any sort of interrupter, that you've got at least those three options to surround it with commas, dashes, or parentheses. And then we've got commentary. The situation, however, is more complicated than it appears. So the however is the writer coming in and saying this is surprising. Or the situation, unfortunately, is more complicated than it appears, in which case, again, the writer is commenting that this is unfortunate. Or the situation, in fact, is more complicated than it appears. Or another sort of commentary would be opinion. Plagiarism, in my opinion, is reprehensible. Plagiarism, according to Keck 2006, is more common among L2 writers than L1 writers. Here, we're giving sort of the who is saying this. We're commenting, this isn't my idea, this is Keck's idea. Now we're going to move from interrupters to conjoined lists. With only two conjuncts, no punctuation is needed. So for example, we will consider two types of sentences, grammatical and punctuated. So here the colon is indicating that what's coming after is an elaboration. It's telling us what those two types of sentences are. But in this case, we've only got two conjuncts, no punctuation needed in our list. With three or more conjuncts, a comma is optional before the conjunction. So there are three types of punctuated sentences: simple, complex, and compound. And this comma here before and is optional. The name for this particular comma is the Oxford comma. And if there's any possibility of confusion, it's best to put a comma in before the conjunction. So in this case, that Oxford comma is really necessary. Otherwise, it's just going to feel like too many ands. So the sentence reads, we will discuss the following topics: nouns and characters, verbs and actions, and cohesion and coherence. Usually, a comma is used to separate conjuncts in a list. However, a semicolon may be used if there is internal punctuation in the items in the list. So here's an example. We will discuss three types of punctuated sentences: simple sentences, sentences with just one clause; complex sentences, sentences with one independent clause and one dependent clause; and compound sentences, sentences with two independent clauses. So notice that each of the conjuncts here has an appositive with it, and as it's an appositive, it needs to have a comma separating it. And if we just had a comma then separating the positive as well as the conjunct, that would just get dizzying. right? We would have a hard time knowing where one conjunct ends and the next begins. And so we use the semicolons here. As I said in the previous video, usually we understand semicolons as acting as weak periods. They are understood to end to be the end of a grammatical sentence. In this case, it's actually operating as a strong comma. So sometimes it's going to be a weak period, sometimes it's a strong